Welcome everyone. My name is Kim Douthit. I work at Spooked in Seattle as a tour guide. I do our paranormal tours, but I also created the murder tour, our true crime tour. And we started doing these, I don't even know how long at this point. We were doing them back in person, maybe 2 years now. We've been doing these. And when COVID started, we moved them online. Now, the killer we're going to be talking about today is an interesting one. And I will be the first to admit, I vaguely knew about him. I knew his name. I knew a little bit about his kills. Mostly, I knew he'd been a contestant on the 1970s show, The Dating Game. I did not know much beyond that. The more I researched, though, the more I was shocked that he is someone we don't talk about more than we do. Not only for the sheer violence and cruelty of his crimes, but the number of potentially unknown victims out there that still haven't been identified. Today, we're going to be talking about Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Now, he was born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Buquor on August 23rd of 1943. He was born to Raul and Ana Marie Gutierrez in San Antonio, Texas. And growing up, he was a well-liked kid. He had an older brother and a sister, as well as a younger sister. And those that knew him talked about how seriously he took school, how nice a kid he was. No one really had anything bad to say about him. Now, he grew up going primarily to Catholic schools. He had lots of friends. He was very, very social. The timeline of the next couple years is a little bit muddy. There was some variations on the dates when I was doing research. But it looks like in 1951, when Rodney was about 8 years old, his grandmother grew ill and she wanted to move back to Mexico to live out her remaining years. So the whole family packed up and moved to Mexico. And this was a big shock to the kids. You know, they had been living in the city and now suddenly they're in this rural area of Mexico. And he would get a further shock a few years later when his father would leave the family. So after, he got very close with his grandmother and she passed away a couple years later. And at this point, they felt like there was no reason to stay in Mexico. So the family packed up and moved to Los Angeles. Now, unlike a lot of the people we talk about here who go on to be serial killers, Rodney came from what was a seemingly very good and caring family. His mother adored him. His siblings loved him. There were no major red flags. He continued to be a strong student, graduated high school in 1960. He joined the Army immediately after graduating, and he became a clerk. This turned out to be kind of a turning point for Rodney, though. He was stationed at Fort Campbell when he went AWOL a number of times, which all by itself is odd, but nobody really thought, hey, we should find out what's going on with this guy, maybe have him talk to a person. So in June of 1963, he took a weekend pass to Nashville, Tennessee, and according to an Army report, stole a car, robbed a driver of their credit card, and fled to New York City. Now, while in New York, according to this report, quote, one night after leaving a bar, he saw a young lady walking down the street. He followed her a short distance and then struck her with a Coke bottle. Thankfully, she was able to get away from him. From there, he went to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And at this point, he's arrested, charged by military justice authorities. Not for the assault, though, not for attacking a woman or stealing a car. He was charged with going AWOL. While they were transporting him back to Fort Campbell, he escaped, hitchhiked to California, and went to his mom's house. She convinced him that he should turn himself in. However, while he was at her house, he apparently exposed himself to his younger sister. And later, Rodney would say he did not know if he wanted to have sexual relations with her. So this was thankfully enough for them to take a little bit of note and say, you know, maybe we should send this guy to talk to a psychiatrist. He was sent to a military psychiatrist who determined that Rodney knew right from wrong, but he was totally unsuitable for further military duty. I feel like that's a given, but there's understatements and there's understatements. He would also be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And what really blew my mind about all of this is he pled guilty to everything. All he had to do was pay a fine. His rank was reduced. He was discharged honorably without any sort of blemish on his record. And then the Army basically washed their hands of him. So he's no longer seeing a psychiatrist. He's not getting any treatment. He's just out. So he goes on to study at the School of Fine Arts at UCLA. He graduated in 1968. On September 25th of 1968, 8-year-old Tammy Shapiro was on her way to school. She had been staying with her family at the Hotel Chateau Marmont in West Hollywood. Their house had burnt down, so they were staying at the hotel while they looked for a new home. And she really loved it there. She loved exploring all around the hotel, but this made her late for school a lot in the mornings. She also didn't particularly like riding the bus. One theory is that she could have been getting bullied, but it's also possible she may have just enjoyed walking. It's September, the weather is beautiful. So that morning, she's walking and a car pulls up next to her. The man inside the car asks her if she would like a ride to school. And she tells him, you know, I don't talk to strangers. And she starts to walk away, but he keeps driving next to her in his car. And he says, oh no, it's okay. I'm not a stranger. I know your parents. So she was wary of him, but he was an adult, and she would later say this. She was raised to trust her elders and be respectful to her elders. So she got in his car. This was witnessed by a man named Donald Haynes, and he thought something seemed fishy. So he followed the car, and he noticed that the car pulled up to an apartment building, and he watched the girl and the man get out, and the girl seemed kind of uncomfortable. She was holding back. So at this point, Donald Haynes is like, no, something's not right. I'm going to call the police. So within minutes, officers showed up, including Officer Chris Camacho. In an interview he later gave to ABC, he recalled, I went and called in a request for a backup unit. I went to the front door and started knocking. I could hear someone running around. The man answered the door, said he'd just been in the shower. And Officer Camacho would say, I see this male person on the other side, no clothes, not dripping with water, no towel. I said, okay, you need to open the door right now. I need to come in. He said, wait, let me put my pants on. I said, okay, you got 3 seconds. So he waited a few more moments, but he heard strange sounds coming from inside. So he decided to stop wasting any time, broke the door down. And what he saw was a horrible sight. I'm going to be showing you some photos. There is no body in the photos, but they still are disturbing, just to give you a little disclaimer. He would say, to the right was a dining room. To the left was a living room. Straight ahead was a kitchen. There was this little girl. She was naked, beaten and bloody. A metal bar was pressed into her neck, which had looked like it had been used to cut her airway off. Her shoes were lying nearby. She wasn't breathing. Camacho thought she was dead, and he said, as I went back in the kitchen, she started gagging. So that put everything into high gear. We later found out the suspect escaped through the back door. So unfortunately, while they were helping her, Alcala got away. She was rushed to the hospital. When she first arrived, the doctors said that there was no hope she would survive, but she pulled through. She was in a coma for 32 days, but she recovered. Her family moved to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico after the attack for a fresh start. When the apartment was examined, they found this student ID card with Rodney Alcala's name on it. They also found hundreds of sexually explicit photos of young women and boys. Police start combing through his life. They're interviewing anyone who knew him, and no one thought it was possible they had the right person. He was such a great guy, this had to be a mistake. So they're trying to find him everywhere, but they're not successful. He's put on the FBI's most wanted list. So to avoid detection, he flees to the East Coast, to New York, changes his name to John Berger, and before long, he enrolls at NYU School of the Arts, studying under the one and only Roman Polanski. And, I'll be frank, I thought about making a joke here, but both of these men are just so deplorable. I can't find any humor at the thought of them together, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Once again, Alcala was in his element. He loved school. He made lots of friends. He was incredibly social. Everyone liked him, and he worked on a number of film crews. He took a job as a summer counselor at a New Hampshire arts camp for children. And you have to love the late 60s, no background check, because he was using an alias, no alarm bells were going off. So he began in the summer of 1969. And again, everyone loved him. He was a natural with the kids. Staff thought he was great. In June of 1971, he received his degree from NYU with honors. And shortly after, he would attack another woman. Cornelia Crilley, born and raised in Queens, grew up in a fairly normal family. She had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Those that knew her described her as very friendly and funny. She was 5'4", brown hair, blue eyes, and all she ever wanted to do was be a TWA stewardess. At age 23, she achieved her goal, moved into an apartment in New York City, and moved in with 2 other flight attendants so she could save money. On June 24th of 1971, she spoke to her mother on the phone to give her the new address of her brand new apartment. Her mom had to go out, said she'd call her back. When she tried Cornelia later, she couldn't get a hold of her. She tried calling her a couple more times over the next few hours and couldn't get a hold of her. So worried, she called Cornelia's boyfriend, Leon Bornstein, and asked him to go check on her. Leon went over to her apartment, knocked, no response. So now he's concerned. He called the police. They arrived, found their way in through a back window. Her body was found in the second bedroom. She had been strangled to death with her own nylons. Her blouse was partially stuffed in her mouth. She'd fought back, whomever she'd been attacked by. There were scratches on her legs. She also had bite marks on her breast and had been assaulted. Sadly, this is New York City in 1971. There was 2,000 murders that year alone. There's no witnesses, no usable clues, no suspects, no arrests. The case remained unsolved until 2011. So later in the summer, Rodney is back working at camp in New Hampshire. A couple of the campers need to go into town to mail some letters. They go to the post office, and what do they see? They see a wanted poster that looks remarkably like their counselor, Mr. Berger. They kind of laugh it off, but because, he's got a different name, he's wanted in California, this is New Hampshire, but they do tell their camp director what they saw. The director calls the FBI. FBI says, act normal. We're going to send out some agents tomorrow. So the next day, agents arrest him. He is sent back to California to be tried for the rape, child molestation, torture, and kidnapping of Tammy Shapiro. So justice might finally be served. But as I mentioned, the Shapiro family had moved to Mexico. They had no desire to return or to subject Tally to any sort of trial. So Rodney pled guilty to child molestation and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was released in August of 1974 after 34 months, apparently magically rehabilitated. He's on parole, living at his mother's house, gets a job with a photography company, taking pictures at weddings. 2 months after he was released, he's arrested again for making a 13-year-old girl smoke marijuana. He served a little bit of time, but he was out again by 1977. Rehabilitated once again, able to rejoin society. I think at this point, what's so frustrating about this case is you can't ever once say, well, no one saw this coming. Because over and over again, this guy is obviously a predator, but he keeps getting released. So he's meeting with his parole officer regularly, and one day he says to his parole officer, hey, I'm thinking about going on vacation to New York City. And of course, the parole officer says, oh yeah, that's a super awesome idea. You go, have fun, send me a postcard. July of 1977, Ellen Hover is a 23-year-old woman living in New York City. She had recently graduated from Beaver College, majored in biology with a minor in music. Her father, Herman Hover, owned Ciro's in Hollywood, so she came from a very well-to-do family. It was a notorious nightclub. Dean Martin, Lucille Ball, Mickey Rooney, they were all known to hang out there. She was very well liked, described as being very kind. In fact, her childhood friends would say she was strikingly beautiful. She had long dark hair and long slender arms and legs and carried herself like a dancer. She was very trusting of other people. She came from a Hollywood family, grew up in Beverly Hills and then Great Neck and then Manhattan. Ellen loved people. She was approached by a man on the street asking if she would want to have her picture taken. She told a friend about it later. She was reported missing on July 15th of 1977, which was one day after the notorious New York City blackout ended. Tensions are a little high in the city. This is also smack dab in the middle of Son of Sam killings. In fact, he would be apprehended, I think, only a couple weeks after she disappeared. But people are on high alert. Police search her apartment, and they notice a notation on her calendar that simply read, John Berger. Now, unlike the last time he was using this alias, the FBI had this on their radar. He's back in Los Angeles at this point, but he's picked up by police. But there's no body. He admits to meeting with Hover, but no evidence, no foul play, nothing to hold him on. They asked if he would submit to a polygraph, and he said, no, thank you. 11 months later, her remains were found hidden under heavy rocks on a hillside on the Rockefeller estate in Westchester. But there was not enough evidence at the time to lead to any suspect, and the case went cold until 2011. Rodney, again, back in LA, doing his thing, hired by the LA Times to work as a typesetter. And once again, everybody loves him. He's also not the only killer in the area. The Hillside Strangler had been killing women as well. He's arrested once more for possession of marijuana, but this was kind of a minor blip. He kept his job, continued working on his photography, and he had this remarkable ability to charm people into letting him take their picture. Men, women, young, old. Oftentimes, he would have them pose nude or in sexually suggestive poses. He met a woman named Sharon Gonzalez through his work. She worked for the LA Times with him. They became friends. He told her all these stories about Hollywood and New York and all of these glamorous pictures he was taking. And she'd later say, I thought it was weird, but I was young. I didn't know anything. When I asked why he took the photos, he said their moms asked him to. I remember the girls were naked. And again, it illustrates how charming and likable Alcala could be, because even when somebody thinks this is kind of weird to have photos of nude children, but I guess if their mom said it was okay. Jill Barcombe, 18-year-old girl from New York, remembered as being bubbly, loved her family, but she was restless. She left home with friends in a van heading to Los Angeles. Didn't tell her family until about a week had gone by. We're not exactly sure how she first met Alcala, but her body would be found in November of 1977 in an LA ravine near the Hollywood sign. She had massive head trauma, had been deprived of oxygen, bite marks on her breast, other wounds on her body, nude from the waist down, strangled with her own blue pants. Initially, though, the suspect was the Hillside Strangler, and she'd end up having a connection to another strangler victim. Her brother later said of his sister's death, it wasn't just murder, it wasn't just rape, it was brutal, it was sadistic, and nobody could understand why the things happened to her. A few weeks after Jill's body was found, 27-year-old Georgia Wickstead, she was a nurse. She didn't show up to pick her friend up for work. Police were called to check on her. When they arrived at her home, they found a window was open and that the screen door had been removed. They went inside, saw blood everywhere. Georgia was dead. Her nude body was on the floor. It had been posed. Police found a handprint on the brass bedding. But at that point in time, they found no match. Her death was extremely hard on her family. Her mother ended up having to be admitted to an institution. And much like Jill, there were never really any suspects. No idea who could have committed such a horrible crime. October of 1977, a young woman named Pamela Jean Lamson met a photographer at an Oakland A's game. He gave her his card. She was an aspiring actor and singer, thrilled to meet someone who could help her on her way. They met up on October 8th of 1977 at Fisherman's Wharf. Her body was found the next day on a trail on Mount Tamalpais. I'm going to say that wrong. Tamalpais? Sure. She was nude. She had been raped and strangled. Now, Alcala was never officially charged in Pamela's death, but police remained positive that he was the person responsible. A witness gave a police sketch of a man that looked like this that was last seen with Pamela Lamson. And this is a picture of him at the time, so you can see the resemblance. And everything we know about him, it's a safe bet to add her to the list of victims. Now, in a weird twist, Alcala would be questioned for murder in March of 1978, but not for any of his murders. A task force investigating the Hillside Strangler case had been going down a list of convicted sex offenders. They finally made their way to Alcala. He had strong alibis for the Hillside Strangler killings. Police crossed him off as their suspect. They did, however, take him in for marijuana possession because he had some out. As an aside, for those of you who are not familiar, the Hillside Strangler, more accurately, the Hillside Stranglers, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. were cousins who killed 10 women together. Bianchi would go on to kill 2 more. They killed in the Los Angeles area in the span of a couple months between 1977 and 1978. Bianchi fled to Bellingham, Washington, where he killed 2 more women before he was apprehended. Buono died of a heart attack in 2002. Bianchi is still serving out a sentence at Walla Walla State Penitentiary here in Washington, and I'm sure at some point we will do a future Tea and True Crime on them. On June 24th of 1978, the body of 32-year-old Charlotte Lamb was found. She was a legal secretary in the Santa Monica area. She was found murdered in the laundry room of an apartment building in California. She had no connection to the building. She'd been strangled with a shoelace, sexually assaulted, and her body was found with the arms folded behind her back, posed. And now we're about to hit what's probably the weirdest part of this case, because something else notable happened in 1978. Something that is honestly, it's not connected to any of his crimes, but it would shape his public identity as a serial killer. In September of 1978, Rodney Alcala was a contestant on the show The Dating Game. That is him on the left there. And if anyone is unfamiliar with the show, it began in 1965. It ran on and off until 1980. It's had a bunch of revivals since then in various forms. And apparently there is a revival planned called Celebrity Dating Game with Zooey Deschanel and Michael Bolton as the hosts. So check your cable listings. The premise was generally a single person, usually a single lady, would be questioning three bachelors who she couldn't see. And after asking them a couple questions, she would choose one to go on a date with all the expenses paid by the show. So somehow he is picked to be a bachelor on the show. And let's break this down for a minute. Let's forget that he murdered a bunch of women, because we know that. No one else does. This guy's a registered sex offender. He brutally raped an 8-year-old girl, left her for dead, has multiple marijuana charges, which, all right, fine, that's not really anything. But one of those charges was for making a minor smoke pot. And you pick this guy for your game show. Apparently, the contestant coordinator thought he was striking. The other contestants didn't agree. Bachelor number 2, Jed Mills, he remembers he was a little creepy. I noticed that right away. In the green room, he jumps in and says, "I always get my girl." I immediately did not like this guy. And honestly, you kind of have to see this to believe it. So I'm going to show you some video clips.
Well, let's see. Bachelor number 1 is a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in the dark room at the age of 13, fully developed. Between takes, he might find him skydiving or motorcycling. Please welcome Rodney Alcala. Rod, welcome.
You know, I've watched this clip. I've watched the whole clip of him on the show a number of times preparing this presentation, and every bit of it still makes me cringe. Our bachelorette for the evening was Cheryl Bradshaw. She had some questions for our bachelors.
Bachelor number 1, I am serving you for dinner.
Oh.
What are you called, and what do you look like?
I'm called the Banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
Bachelor 1, later.
Even without knowing this guy's a serial killer, that answer would creep me out, but apparently not Cheryl. Because...
I'm going to ask you a question. Will that date be Bachelor number 1, Bachelor number 2, or Bachelor number 3? Who gets the dates?
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take 1.
Number 1, Bachelor number 1. All right. Well, there they go. However, you did leave one remaining, and this is your date, and I want to tell you something about him, Cheryl. He's a skydiver, so he's got a lot of nerve. He's into motorcycling. He's also a fine photographer. Say hello to Rodney Alcala. Rodney, come on and say hello. Congratulations, Rod. You did it with the one answer.
You can find the whole clip of him on the show online. It's kind of surreal. Apparently after this meeting, the charm did not last. She called the show the next day and said she did not want to go on a date with him because she got weird vibes and didn't feel comfortable. And you know, when this gets reported, a lot of people say, "Oh, she lucked out. This probably saved her life." Honestly, I doubt it. Like, he's not dumb. People would have known he was on a date with her. If she suddenly showed up dead, he would have been a suspect and would have been questioned. But still, I wouldn't have wanted to go out on a date with him because he's hella creepy. So good on her for avoiding him. So February 13th of 1979, a 15-year-old girl named Monique Hoyt was hitchhiking into town. Man pulled up in his car, asked her if she'd like to pose for some photographs. She was flattered, so she got in the car with him. They head to his mother's house because he said he had to get some equipment. But by the time they got there, he said, "Oh, you know what? There's no more light, so we'll spend the night here. We'll go out tomorrow morning." Next morning, they drove to an area about 80 miles outside of LA. He leads her to a secluded area in the woods, took some pictures, asked her to remove her clothes, which she did, took some more pictures. Suddenly, she's struck in the head with a blunt object. Now, she's unconscious for a bit, and she regains consciousness. She keeps pretending she's asleep. Alcala attacks her, sexually assaults her, biting her, and at this point, she does start to scream. He stuffs a t-shirt in her mouth and then chokes her until she passes out. She wakes up again. She's been tied up, but she's still alive, and he's sobbing next to her. Somehow, this 15-year-old girl is able to stay calm and knew the best way, and probably the only way she was going to get out of this, was to get him to trust her. So she says she likes him and she wants to know if he's okay. She says, "Can we go back to your house?" And eventually he unties her, leads her back to the car. They're driving back to town. They stop so he can use the restroom. And at this point, she runs for it. She goes into a hotel near where they stopped, and police are called. After she's taken to the police station, she identifies Alcala from a picture right away. So they go to question him. He's at his mother's house. He can't produce an alibi. He's arrested. He's charged. His mother posts his bail. This would be a fatal mistake for some more young women. In June of 1979, 21-year-old college student Jill Parente goes to a Dodgers game. When she gets home, she's never seen alive again. She doesn't show up for work the next day, so police are called. She's found in her bedroom, sexually assaulted, propped up with a pillow posed next to her bed. She'd been beaten and strangled. And it wouldn't be until 2004, when DNA could be tested, that Alcala would be linked to her death. Shortly after Jill's murder, Rodney Alcala would strike again. On June 20th of 1979, he heads out to Sunset Beach. He approaches some young women, asks to take their picture. They wouldn't go with him. He heads down to Huntington Beach, approaches 12-year-old Robin Samso and her friend. Now, her friend refuses to talk to this guy and makes enough of a fuss that a parent walks over to see why there is a grown man talking to two children. He moves on. Later that afternoon, Robin was running late. She answered phones at the ballet studio so she could pay for her own ballet classes. Her friend told her to take her bike. Later that evening, Robin's brother called because Robin never showed up at the ballet studio. Police were called. Her friend remembered the strange man that they'd spoken to and is able to provide police with enough details that a sketch is drawn. Now, Rodney Alcala's parole officer recognized him from this sketch, as did our good Samaritan who had called the police all those years before after seeing Tammy Shapiro get into Rodney Alcala's car. I found some reports, and this was utterly maddening, that a 20-year-old firefighter would spot Alcala dragging a girl into the woods, and for some reason, she decided to keep her observation to herself. I don't know why. I never read a good explanation as to why she didn't report this, but there you go. Rodney would cut his hair after this. Told his girlfriend at the time he wanted to move to Texas to start a photography business. He also told other friends he wanted to move to Chicago. 12 days after she disappeared, Robin's body was found in the Sierra Madres. Initially, identification was hard. Animals had scavenged the body, but dental records confirmed it was Robin Samso. They also found her shoe at the scene. The body was so badly decomposed, the exact cause of death could not be determined, but they could tell she had been struck in the face because some of her teeth were broken. On July 24th of 1979, Rodney Alcala was arrested at his mother's house and charged with Robin's murder. Now, while searching his home, authorities found a receipt for a storage facility in Shoreline, Washington. It appeared he'd only recently rented it before his arrest. When they went to the locker, and what was kind of an interesting little detail when I was researching is apparently their search warrant didn't allow them to actually pick up the receipts, but because it was out, they copied down the details. And Alcala would later mention the storage locker to his sister while she was visiting him in jail, and they decided that they needed to go check it out ASAP. Inside it, they found thousands of pictures of men, women, many of them nude photos or sexually suggestive photos, and they also found trophies, pieces of jewelry. These seem to be things he took from his victims. Among this jewelry was a small pair of gold ball earrings. Gold ball earrings that were worn by Robin. His trial began in 1980. He was charged with murdering Robin Samsoe. To the surprise of no one, he was found guilty. He was sentenced to death in the gas chamber. But this would not be the end. He appealed the sentence. 4 years later, won a new trial. Verdict was overturned because the jurors had been informed of his past crimes, and it was deemed that was unfair and it influenced them. The new trial was set for 1986. He was once again found guilty, sentenced to death, appealed it. In 2001, he got his death penalty overturned because he argued he did not receive a strong enough defense from his attorney. So now it's 2003. Case is going to trial for a third time. And this was devastating to the family of Robin Samsoe. Being subjected once again to not only another trial, but having to face the man who brutally murdered their daughter. This time, though, things were a little different. Because now, again, it's 2003 and technology has advanced. We can test DNA. So using DNA technology and the jewelry that was found in the storage locker, they are now able to concretely link Alcala to Charlotte Lamb, Jill Parente, Georgia Wixted, and Jill Barcombe. Now, this was sort of a defining moment because up until this point, he was known as a man who murdered a little girl. Now, he's a serial killer. In 2006, they agreed that all 5 of these murders would be consolidated into one trial instead of 5 separate trials. And he's fighting to represent himself in this trial because it worked so well for Ted Bundy. He won the right to represent himself and be his own lawyer. His third trial began on January 11th of 2010. His defense of himself took a lot of really bizarre turns. In fact, at one point, he was interviewing himself and he was using different voices to answer questions. There was also another surprise. For the first time, Tammy Shapiro testified against the man who had brutally raped her and left her for dead. He later apologized to her in court. She said, he's never apologized before, and for him to even bother, I mean, that made me sick to my stomach. On February 25th of 2010, he is once again found guilty and sentenced to death. While on death row, he is finally linked to the 2 murders in New York City. In January of 2013, he pleads guilty to the murders of Cornelia Crilley and Ellen Hover. Authorities decide that now is the time to see if they can link him to any more murders. So they release a number of the pictures they found in the storage locker in Seattle, hoping maybe someone's going to recognize a missing relative. Maybe they can find some additional victims. Even though they released a lot of the pictures, and you can find all of these pictures available online that have been released, a lot of them were withheld because of how graphically sexual they were. So in 1977, Christine Thornton, known by Chris to her friends and family, she was traveling with her boyfriend from where they were living in San Antonio to Montana to pan for gold. Her family described her as a free spirit who liked to do things like this. She was 27 years old, tall, 5'10", dark hair, dark eyes. She was also about 6 months pregnant. Now, at some point during this trip, she had a fight with her boyfriend and he left her. She was probably hitchhiking somewhere around Wyoming. By the summer of 1978, her sister hadn't heard from her and was worried. So she went to San Antonio to try to locate her sister. Nothing. Tried to file a missing persons report, but because her sister was an adult, the police wouldn't let her. Chris is never heard from, and the family wonders what could have happened to her. In 1982, remains would be found by herders of a young woman who was 25 to 35 years old, but could not be identified. Amongst the remains, which were bones, as you can see in this picture, they also found the remains of an infant, so they knew the woman was pregnant. The bones had been there for some time, and the estimate was probably around 1977, but they couldn't find any other information. Case went cold. In 2013, the case was handed over to a sheriff's deputy to see if he can get any new hits. Found out, oh, we still have access to the remains. Let's send them to be tested. And at some point, Chris's sister is emailed by her son saying, hey, you should look through these photos that were just released online. She looks at the pictures, and there's one that immediately catches her attention because it's her sister, Chris. So she submits her DNA to the national database, and in 2015, the remains were positively identified as Chris Thornton's. A rough timeline is put together. The murder most likely happened when Alcala had been given permission to travel from California to New York on his vacation because he had driven, and somewhere probably on his return trip, he met up with Chris. So in 2016, he's charged with first-degree murder in Wyoming. At this point, though, he's 73. He's in poor health. He is confined to a bed. He's shown the picture. He said, yeah, I took the picture. I met up with her. I didn't kill her. The charges have not been dropped, but given his poor health and the fact that he was already on death row, there seemed to be no point to extradite him to Wyoming for a trial. On top of Chris Thornton, at least 6 families said they believed they recognized loved ones who had disappeared and were never found from the pictures. 21 people have also identified themselves in the pictures and have said, I'm alive and well. He's been linked to a handful of other killings. Antoinette Tony Whitaker, 13-year-old girl, had been living in foster home in Washington State. She was last seen leaving with a man with long reddish colored hair on July 9th of 1977. Her body was found a week later, fully clothed in Lake City, appearing to have been, it was posed on her hands and knees, had been there for about a week. She was stabbed to death, did not appear to be sexually assaulted. And I will say for me, this one is kind of a stretch. Stabbing was not ever part of his MO, and he generally assaulted his victims. The only connection seems to be that he posed the body. And he's certainly not the first killer to do that. He also was linked to the death of Joyce Gaunt. I could not find a picture of her. Her body was found on February 17th of 1978 at a picnic area at Seward Park. She had been beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted. She was found nude and her skull was crushed. So in 2019, the state of California put a moratorium on the death penalty. And so Alcala is currently serving life in prison, and he remains today. Through the years, he has been asked to help identify additional victims. He has always refused to cooperate. What's utterly frustrating is that without his cooperation, we'll probably never know any of his other victims. And there most definitely are more. This is a man who left his bodies posed to be found. He would render them unconscious, wait for them to regain consciousness, and torment them more. He has 8 confirmed victims. Chris Thornton would be 9 with a handful of other possible victims. To this day, again, we don't know how many people he killed. Some estimate as high as 130. To me, that's a little bit of a stretch, but who knows? Tammy Shapiro would later say in an interview, "I'm one of Rodney Alcala's first and one of his only living victims. It should have stopped with me. Why in the world are there so many other victims when it was a known fact what he did to me?" And it is hard to wonder how many lives could have been saved if he had been held accountable back then. But at least we know he is in prison and will remain there the rest of his life. And that is the story of Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. We'll take questions in just a moment. Thank you all for listening in. As always, tipping is never necessary. It's always appreciated. You can find me on Venmo at Kim-Douthit. Mark, do we have any other upcoming events?
No, not at this time, but we hopefully will have some news soon.
Other than our next Tea and True Crime, which will once again be on the 3rd Sunday of March, which I think is also March 21st. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. And awesome. So if there are any questions, comments, thoughts on the universe.
Great job, Kim. That's very good.
Thank you.
Very interesting. I was always curious about him, especially seeing him on the dating game. It's like,
The dating game clips, again, I recommend, well, if you want to, it's kind of trippy watching the full clip of him on the show. I didn't even play all of his answers. Some of it, it's just.
well, especially when you know what kind of person he is. Yeah.
Yes. Even without knowing what kind of person he is, the whole exchange just makes you feel icky. It really does.
They did a really good
remembering
on
that
this on 2020, and it's on Hulu if you want to.
Remembering that time, the whole show was creepy.
Yeah, that's true.
The entire show was creepy from
was very
start to
creepy.
finish.
A friend of mine was actually she was actually a contestant on the pilot, the original pilot that you know Heather June.
Oh yes, uh-huh.
Yeah, Heather was actually on the pilot, the original pilot back in like 1965.
Oh wow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well,
Now,
and apparently when they kind of revived the show in the 70s, they were encouraging it to be more innuendo driven. And so I'm sure given the opportunity, he was happy to go there. I do appreciate, Ray, your comment about if we're talking 70s attractive, he's more attractive than Bundy. Yeah, I mean,
I just have never gotten that whole Bundy was so attractive he could lure women to his car thing. He was not.
And that unibrow,
It was awful.
Bundy's whole thing was that he played defenseless. He broke into homes.
Well, he was very charming too, you know.
Not as charming as he thinks, but yes, Alcala's the one. I find interesting is how much people were just floored when it was revealed he did these things. Like, no, it couldn't have been him. He's the nicest guy. He's so charming. He's so kind. And yet he's showing his coworkers photos he's taking of new children. And nobody thinks like,
no, what the hell?
It's a red flag. Irish American.
All the women you talked, all the victims you talked about were women. Did he have
Yes.
pictures of men too? And
He did. And I didn't post any of the pictures that have been released. Again, you can find them easily online. He has a lot of pictures of mostly young men. But he would go out and just take pictures. He would go out and approach people any age, men, women, and just say, "Hey, I'm a photographer. Can I take your picture?" So there's nothing that indicates he ever attacked a man. At least not in anything I found, or at least never that's been discovered.
Just amazing how easily these people or these, young people just went with him. Oh, that sounds groovy. Let me take my picture. You look like a nice guy.
I was alive in the 70s. Is this real? Like the impression I get of the 70s, man, from studying all
pretty free,
is just, it's amazing anybody survived.
Yeah, that's the truth.
I'm shocked.
Oh my God.
Irish serial killer would be awesome too. I'll see what I can do. Is the 21st St. Patrick's Day, or is it just?
No, but it's around there.
17th is St. Patrick's Day.
I'll see if I can find an Irish American or an Irish serial killer in honor of those.
As an Irish American, I feel like we can represent in the murder category.
Oh, I have no doubt.
I have no doubt either.
Or just like pick any serial killer from Boston and they're probably Irish.
Boston Strangler. I'll have to look. I haven't picked next month's killer yet. So I'll take a look at what there is, and always open to suggestions. I won't accidentally throw my notes out this time, which is what happened last time. I had all these beautiful notes, and then they got mixed in with some other recycling notes, and they went away. Any other questions, thoughts, comments, observations?
Yeah, Kim. Hey, it's Chris.
Hi.
Hey, how common is it for I don't know, other convicted killers in a similar situation to withhold admission of, further victims, that sort of thing? Like, are there any advantages or disadvantages? Like, what's the?
There are advantages. Well, there's advantages and there's disadvantages. You have killers like Gary Ridgway, who was able to work his way out of a death penalty sentence by giving more information.
Yeah, is that for this guy?
They offered, and the thing is he was initially only charged with Robin's death, and he maintained his innocence. He said, "I didn't kill her," and it wasn't until the last trial that they had linked him to all these other deaths, and a whole new picture started emerging. So at the time, there was no reason to really try to leverage anything with him because they didn't know he killed other people.
Yeah.
So the reveal that he had killed additional women is something that came later, and he's maintained his innocence. And at this point, I mean, for some of them, it's a pride thing, it's an ego thing. You have like Bundy didn't fully like embrace his serial killerness until it became apparent there was no further appeals, that he was not going to be getting out of it. And then after he had exhausted all of his appeals and he's still on death row and he's looking death in the eye, he was like, "Okay, cool, now I'll talk, but you got to keep me alive for me to keep talking." So it's often a ploy to, if you get sentenced to death, to either avoid the death penalty or not. But some serial killers just never want to admit to doing it. You know what? It was rough to not comment on the hair, but also as a fellow curly-haired person, I didn't want to it's, he had very large hair.
It wasn't the curls, Kim. It was like everything. It was like the weird, like.
Like the whole, you know what gets me is the more recent trial photos where he's got he looks like an old Weird Al. Like if Weird Al went completely gray. And that always creeps me out when I was looking at all those pictures.
He totally does.
It can it depends too. Like, there's different kinds of serial killers. And so depending on what their own individual brand of whatever is, that'll influence whether or not they're willing to talk. Some of them want the recognition, and you've got the killers like John Wayne Gacy is a great example, who's like, oh yeah, I'm confessing to this and this and this and this and this, and they're mostly lies. You have the killers who once they're arrested want to go for the glory and want to be linked to as many deaths as possible. So half of what they confess to, H.H. Holmes was like that. You know, all these deaths that he confessed to, and a bunch of them were people who were still alive. But so it's the individual psychology of the killer can very much determine the direction they're going to go in. I find Alcala interesting because he's one where you can't look at his childhood, at least from what we know. You can't look at his childhood and be like, you know, he was beaten, he was abused, he suffered trauma. No, he's just a psychopath. And there's not much you can do about that. The dating game suit was here. Yeah, the dating game suit was here. Find fashion choices in the 70s a little eerie in general. So any other questions? Comments on fashion or hair? So I have a request for the Irish American killer. Or an Irish killer. I'll see what I can do. Any other requests for future Tea and True Crimes? Okay, cool. Our next one will be on the March 21st, I believe. So I'll get a killer over to Mark fairly soon so we can advertise who our next selection will be.
I'm curious to do at some point a pair. I'd like to see what the interaction between them would be.
Well, I will say that all the talk of the Hillside Strangler has me interested in Brian the Grudge Slayer. Yes. In looking into the Hillside Strangler, and there's been other pairs that might be interesting to take a look at. I also need to give a plug. I'm involved on I've been working on a true crime podcast with Brian, who is here today, and a few others called A Night in Question. And we have our Facebook group up now. So if you want to like the page, episodes for that should be starting in April, I think is what we decided. I don't remember exactly when. Yes, April 7th. Brian knows better than me. So be on the lookout for that as well, because I think it'll be a good time. It's about a Seattle murder. So awesome. Cool. Well, if there's no other questions.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kim.
See you all in a month.
All right.